Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Lebanon. And to be perfectly honest, Lebanon is a mess. For those of us lucky enough to be living in the Western world, it is almost impossible to fathom just how bad the situation in Lebanon is. Since August of 2019, a mere 28 months ago, the Lebanese pound, their currency, has lost 90% of its value. 90%. If you lived in Lebanon, the $1,000 in savings you might have, had plus 2 years ago, by the way, is only worth $100 today. Lebanon was a once thriving economic cultural center. It was known as the Switzerland of the Middle East, a center of banking and investment. Despite wars and even internal conflicts, Lebanon was always able to rebuild and rebuild. It rebounded. But that was once upon a time. For Lebanon, what once was is no more. Experts suggest that even if there was a way to build back Lebanon, it would take a good 7 to 10 years from what it is right now. It's not that the Lebanese government is dysfunctional. Actually, dysfunctional would be a compliment, a step up. Lebanon as a country has stopped functioning. The Lebanese government and the Lebanese economy are paralyzed as a result of an investigation into a gargantuan explosion that crippled the port of Beirut on August 4th, 2020. The government, the prime minister, and his cabinet have not met since October 12th. Clearly, 3,000 tons of explosives that were stored in cargo hold in the port exploded, but not exploded. The blast was a good 2.7 kilotons of force. At that point, it was comparable to a little boy. The bomb that hit Hiroshima was only 13 kilotons. The spontaneous explosion resulted in 218 deaths, 7,000 injuries, 300,000 people were homeless. In an instant, homeless. And these numbers are vastly underreported. The explosives sitting in that storage facility, an explosion that was so powerful people felt it 50 miles away, are widely believed, though not publicly acknowledged, to belong to Hezbollah and Iran. And that is the crux of the Lebanese impasse. Lebanon's president, Michel Aoun, went on TV recently and said, enough. The president proceeded to blame the problems besetting the besieging Lebanon all on Hezbollah and Iran. Aoun declared that Lebanon must stand up and stop Hezbollah from destroying Lebanon. And this is a quote, the deliberate, systematic, and unjustified disruption that leads to institutions dismantling and the dissolution of the state must stop, unquote. He said that Hezbollah is causing, quote, the ruin of the state, unquote. The president also voiced another gripe against Hezbollah. He voiced his conviction that Hezbollah's support for the rebels in Yemen has caused a huge rift between Lebanon and other countries, other Arab countries, who would help them, the Lebanese. Those other countries are Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. The Arab world, he contends, now view Hezbollah and Lebanon as one and the same. And he's quoted here, what is the justification for straining relations with these countries and interfering in matters that do not concern us, Aoun said. And he said that Hezbollah should not be protecting Lebanon. That's the role of the Lebanese army. Quote, it is true that defending the homeland requires cooperation between the army, the people, and the resistance, unquote. Aoun continued, quote, but the primary responsibility lies with the state. Only the state sets the defense strategy and guarantees its implementation, unquote. It is a direct attack against Hezbollah. And the president is fighting, and the ripple effect is actually hurting Hezbollah. And in many ways, Hezbollah is hurting the country. Israel, he says, is attacking Lebanon because of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is provoking Israel. Taking a cue from their president, the people of Lebanon are awakening and shaking off their paralyzing despair and beginning publicly to take a stand against Hezbollah. But good intentions may not be enough. The system is stacked against the president and the citizens of Lebanon. The entire system of government permits Hezbollah overwhelming power. In broad strokes, Lebanon is roughly divided into 3 parts. One part is Sunni, they're about 28% of the population. One part is Shiite, they're about 28%. And the last part is Christian, and they're 22%. The remainder are smaller groups within Lebanon. The Lebanese system of government is actually called confessionalism. The president must be a Maronite Christian. The prime minister must be a Sunni, and the speaker of the parliament must be a Shiite. Those are the 3. The Deputy Prime Minister and the Deputy Speaker of the Parliament must be Eastern Orthodox Christian. By its very nature, this system allows Hezbollah, a Shiite organization sponsored by Iran, enormous power. Even if the other 2/3 of Lebanon were to make their voices known loudly and clearly, Hezbollah and Iran would still have a significant voice. And there is no reason for either Hezbollah or Iran to change their points of view and their behavior vis-a-vis Lebanon. There is no threat that the rest of Lebanon can hold anything over them. Hezbollah Iranian forces are stronger, better trained, and better equipped than the Lebanese army. The only force that frightens them in this small country, and this is the irony, is that small country situated to Lebanon's southern border called Israel. In a strange twist of fate, if Hezbollah was to all-out attack Israel, Israel might actually liberate Lebanon from the noose around their neck by destroying or substantially degrading Hezbollah. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from the Jerusalem Post, and it was published December 28th, 2021. The column was written by Danny Damon. Damon should be familiar to all of us. He was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. The piece is entitled, "We Must Crack Down on Anti-Semitism." Opinion. Subtitled, "Perhaps anti-Semitism will never be eliminated from our world, but these actions can certainly reduce the level of damage and evil it sows." Damon addressed Jew hatred, I call it Jew hatred, not anti-Semitism, and our necessary response. He postulates that while it may never disappear, we need to respond regardless. This is how he begins. The year 2021 set a negative tone in relation to anti-Semitism. There were several reasons for this: the pandemic, the Operation Guardian of the Walls, and the continued activity of the BDS movement, which relentlessly promoted their false campaign against the State of Israel, which in their opinion is pursuing an apartheid policy in Judea and Samaria. All these events served to create waves of hatred, and Jews around the world have subsequently witnessed aggressive acts of verbal and physical violence. Damon mentions an EU report that parallels the conspiracies of the Middle Ages that Jews caused the plague with our world today. Yes, while it might be hard for us to believe, there are many people today who believe that, like the bubonic plague, aka the Black Plague, COVID was caused by the Jews. Damon writes, the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights published a report in November stating that, like instances from the plague in the Middle Ages, where conspiracy theories and new myths arose blaming Jews for the plague, so too with the outbreak of the pandemic. Jew hatred is on the rise, and there is no sign of it slowing down. Damon cites statistics now explaining the FBI and others. He writes, the FBI reports that anti-Semitism remains number one hate crime in the United States. Recent data demonstrates that Jews and Jewish institutions were the most common target against which hate crimes were committed. They account for 58% of religious hate crime incidents. Earlier this year, anti-Semitism in the United States rose by 80%. And in the UK, the number of anti-Semitic incidents increased by 570%. Worldwide attacks against Jews have increased. Unfortunately, in this coming year, we will have to continue to tackle this growing wave of anti-Semitism. Damon explains that states have begun to defend Israel. They have passed anti-BDS and anti-boycott Israel laws. He explains that defending Israel and fighting BDS is a bipartisan issue in the United States. Both parties, Republican and Democrat, have an overwhelming consensus and are pro-Israel. Ambassador Damon concludes by writing the following. In the United States, there is a consensus, both among Republican and Democratic parties, that the social networks should no longer be granted immunity from the content published on their platforms, and changes must be made to the law. I believe that, following the U.S. legislation, more countries in Europe will summon their courage and enact laws that will hold social media platforms accountable and thus allow citizens to complain when there is insightful or anti-Semitic content, and if necessary, enable them to file a lawsuit against the social network if it does not remove the offensive post. Perhaps anti-Semitism will never be eliminated from our world, but these actions can certainly reduce the level of damage and evil it sows. This is an excellent column by Danny Damon and is 100% correct. Next up is a column from Israel Hayom. It was published on December 29th, 2021, and was written by Ricky Hollander. The column was originally published in JNS, and it's about BDS also. The title of the column is BDS, the latest chapter in the sordid history of anti-Jewish boycott. Subtitle: The violent and discriminatory nature of BDS is evidenced by its targeting the Jewish state alone for attack and by its leaders and members' justification of verbal or physical violence against Israelis, Jews, and Jewish supporters of Israel. This is an excellent piece about the history of boycotts against Jews. Of course, it is a condemnation of BDS. It should be clear that BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, follows a long line of movements that perpetuated and perpetrated Jew hatred. This is how the column begins. The boycott of Jews has a long and sordid history. A classic weapon of anti-Semitism, the boycott ostracizes and disenfranchises Jews by depriving them of education, livelihood, civil rights, and camaraderie. Historic manifestations of the anti-Semitic boycott include barring Jews from practicing certain professions, or holding agricultural leases, denying Jews membership in associations, societies, guilds, limiting the number of Jews allowed to attend universities, picketing Jewish businesses, and pressuring people to reject Jewish services. Hollander now gives readers a history lesson. She writes, boycotts against Jews have been historically employed to diffuse societal unrest and divert anti-government protests by turning the focus of blame on the Jew. From late 19th century onward, "Don't buy from Jews, buy from Christians only," and "each to his own" were commonly heard slogans in Europe, as organized boycotts targeted Jews as the scapegoats for the rising unemployment and poverty. Boycott organizers justified their anti-Jewish actions as defensive tactic or retribution for alleged wrongdoing by Jews. No sooner had Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party risen to power in Germany in 1933 than they organized a boycott against Jews and retribution for unfavorable press and boycotts of Nazis that were occurring across the world. It marked the beginning of Hitler's campaign against Jews that resulted in the Nazis' so-called final solution, the genocide of European Jews. Hollander proceeds to describe Arab boycotts and then brings us to the BDS movement. The latest iteration of the Arab boycott is the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions BDS campaign against the Jewish state, which, like the previous boycotts, is recognized as an anti-Semitic tool of discrimination against Jews. As a result, there has been a global backlash. Hollander addresses the elephant in the room. What about the First Amendment issue of free speech? Isn't BDS an exercise of free speech? She argues both points and quotes a constitutional law professor saying that BDS simply covers up discrimination. The column continues. George Mason law professor Eugene Kontrovich, an expert in international law, has similarly pointed out that the First Amendment allows state governments to place conditions like anti-discrimination restrictions on those with whom they engage in business. And hence, if states can choose to not do business with South African companies because their policies and practices, which BDS proponents wholeheartedly support, it also means that they can choose to not do business with private companies because of other discriminatory policies, like boycott of Israel. He explains the campaign to boycott Israel in reality seeks to legitimize discriminatory refusals to deal with people or companies simply because of their connection to the Jewish state. This is a legitimization of bigotry, just as boycotts of people because of their race, sexual orientation, and national origin would be discriminatory. In the end, Hollander concludes that historical knowledge of anti-Jewish boycotts is essential. She writes, in order to weigh both sides of the debate about anti-Jewish boycott and understand why so many seek to combat it, one must be familiar with the boycott's history and its inherent anti-Semitism. This column is very long and detailed, but it's exceptional. It is essential that these reminders of what has happened and what is happening be brought out into the open. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I'm going to show you 6 cartoons, memes, and headlines today. If you've noticed, I've started to add headlines to this section. In many ways, headlines are the funniest. They're funnier than cartoons and memes. They are real gaffes, not fictionalized. First up is a cartoon of a store that was totally looted. The store actually is called the Woke Store. Through the broken window, we witness a conversation between 2 people in the store. One says, "They took everything." The second says, "They left behind the defund the police and the woke stickers." On the broken window are stickers that read criminal justice reform and bail reform. This is just funny, but people are starting to wake up about the crime waves and the dangers, especially the looting, happening all around us. This next meme is about Don Adams and his hilariously funny TV show Get Smart. His character's name is Maxwell Smart, and he was an agent with 86. Remember, he had a shoe phone, and in the picture, he's talking into his shoe phone. The caption reads, "If memory serves me right, this was the first smartphone." The humor of Smart, the character using a smartphone, actually is the first smartphone. It's very funny because his name is Max Smart. The next meme is making fun of school students and everyone else. 2 dogs are sitting in a classroom at their desks. The caption reads, "I don't know what they are learning, but they're trying their best." If you don't know this already, pets are the most watched item on the internet. Next up is a headline. It's the New Zealand way of stopping teens from smoking, which has spiked lately around the world. It reads, "New Zealand to ban young people from ever being able to buy cigarettes." The sale of cigarettes to minors is illegal in the United States, by the way. Smoking is not, which is a different issue. Next up is a headline that gives us an example of just how crazy life is under a dictatorship like in North Korea. North Korea is commemorating the 10th anniversary of the death of Kim Jong-il. And here's the headline. North Korea bans laughing for 11 days of mourning for the 10th anniversary of Kim Jong-il's death. This last item is a headline also, and it's a kind of fact that leads one to question how intelligent humans actually are. At the same time, it's funny and really sad. The headline reads, "Study, 70% of men would rather die early than give up meat." Now that's crazy. Where are their priorities? In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. It's Abbas versus Abbas. There are 2 important people in the Palestinian establishment with the name Abbas. Abbas and the confusion that it would cause is spreading. Mahmoud Abbas is the head of the Palestinian Authority. Mansour Abbas is the head of the United Arab Party, a member of the Knesset, and part of the Israeli government coalition. Mansour Abbas recently said, quote, "The state of Israel was born as a Jewish state and it will remain one," unquote. He made that statement while speaking at a press conference convened by Globes, Israel's economic newspaper. The Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas refuses to recognize Israel as a Jewish state and was outraged by the comments made by the other Abbas. His response was, and I'm quoting here, "These irresponsible statements are consistent with the calls of extremists in Israel to displace the Palestinians and harm the status of the blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque and the history of the Palestinian people," unquote. President Mahmoud Abbas added that Knesset member Mansour Abbas represents only himself when he talks about accepting Israel as a Jewish state. He says, quote, "He does not represent the Palestinian people at home and anywhere in the world," unquote. And these remarks are, quote, "contradict religion, history, and the Palestinian heritage," unquote. In a statement released by his office, PA President Abbas accuses the other Abbas of being part of, quote, "current that promotes the Zionist colonial project." It is unfortunate that instead of siding with the rights of his people and condemning the settlements, killings, and displacement committed by the occupation and the plans of Israeli extremists to empty Palestinian lands, we see him repeating the lies of the Zionist movement, unquote. The reality is that each Abbas has a relationship with Israel, and they should both be working together with Israel. Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett announced that the Israeli government is planning to double the number of people who live in the Golan Heights. Double. The government will invest $300 million to lure and entice Israelis to move north to the Golan. About 50,000 people now live in the Golan Heights. The population is divided evenly between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, especially Druze. Israel captured the Golan Heights from Syria in the 1967 Six-Day War. In 1981, Israel annexed the Golan. And on March 25, 2019, under the administration of then-President Donald Trump, the United States recognized the Golan as part of Israel. Most other countries in the world do not recognize that decision. The Golan Heights is filled with Jewish history. The decision to move more Israelis into the Golan is a strategy to make certain that Israel will not be forced to evacuate the area. From atop the Golan, the entire valley below is in the crosshairs of anyone sitting on the heights. Keeping the Golan is a security necessity for Israel. Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela announced that he is planning an official visit to Iran. Maduro said that the invitation was extended to him by the Iranian president and that he has accepted the invitation. Iran and Venezuela are allies. They're joined together because they are both members of OPEC. They both have U.S. sanctions against them also. Iran has helped Venezuela update their oil production and helped get them back online. In exchange, because Venezuela was hurting so badly for oil, Iran broke international sanctions and shipped their oil to Venezuela. In an interview on the Venezuelan state TV, Maduro said, quote, "I'm going to Tehran very soon for a visit with that president, Ibrahim Raisi, offered me so that we meet in person, to hold conversations and sign new agreements and speed up the process of cooperation," unquote. Israel has begun Operation Shield the North. The purpose of this operation is to provide the residents of the North who live in that part of Israel with bomb shelters to protect them from rockets and missiles that may be shot into Israel from Lebanon or from Syria. All total, there are 21 communities situated on the border who will need to have their existing shelters either reinforced or new ones built. Operation Shield the North came about as a direct result of a 2020 Comptroller's report, which revealed that 30% of Israelis do not have access to functioning shelters in the event of a bombing. Israel needs to prepare for an onslaught of rockets from the north. Until now, they've relied on what are called interceptors, like the Iron Dome. But interceptors can only shoot down so many rockets and missiles. Citizens of Israel need to be safe. They need well-built, well-protected bomb shelters in which they can, when necessary and if necessary, hunker down and wait out the storm. A poster condemning anti-vaxxers with the Star of David on it appeared in 2 different locations in the LA area. One of the posters was displayed outside the Baba Sali Synagogue. The second poster was at Cedar Sinai Medical Center. On these posters, the Star of David was shown. It's known as Magen David also. It's composed in this poster as an A. On top of the A is the letter V, anti-vax. It is clearly identifiable as a Star of David. The poster's caption reads, "Report anti-vaxxers because you care and they don't," and includes a telephone number. According to the local media outlet, it went to a restaurant in Hollywood. Police are investigating. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz hosted Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas for a meeting. The meeting took place at Gantz's home in Rosh Ha'ayin. This is the first time since 2010 that Abbas was in Israel, with the sole exception of Shimon Peres's funeral in 2016. The meeting lasted for 2.5 hours. Also present were Israeli Major General Rassan Aliyan, Palestinian Minister of Civil Affairs Hussein al-Sheikh, and Palestinian Chief of Intelligence Majid Faraj. Following the meeting, Defense Minister Gantz's office released this statement, quote, "The two discussed various security and civil issues. The Defense Minister emphasized the shared interest in strengthening security coordination and maintaining stability and preventing terrorism and violence," unquote. The statement also revealed that Gantz told Abbas that he intends to, quote, further promote bond-building steps in the economic and civilian spheres as the two agreed on during their last meeting, unquote. This was the second meeting between Benny Gantz and Mahmoud Abbas. The first took place in August in Ramallah. This historic meeting still grips the attention of Israelis and Palestinians. Alibaba is a very large, very popular Chinese e-commerce site. Most of you probably know it. And they announced that they will no longer deliver to the Palestinian Authority. The announcement came in the form of a message sent by AliExpress, a part of the Alibaba company and the delivery system. The decision is not political. It's purely business. It's logistical and based on the jumbling of packages. Due to a PA policy, many Alibaba packages have not reached their destinations in the PA. That's because the PA Postal Service will not deliver a package that has Israel as part of its address. It's a matter of policy. But many Palestinians who order from Alibaba put Israel as part of their address. Alibaba decided that the problems this causes and the damage to their reputation and the inefficiency of non-delivered package outweighs the gains and their profits. So they simply cut off the Palestinians. Since their original announcement, though, Alibaba has started resuming deliveries to the PA. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that, well, I mentioned the Black Plague earlier. It's known as the Black Plague or the Black Death or the bubonic plague. It's also known as the plague or the pestilence. It was such a huge plague that it didn't need another name other than the definite article. In the plague, a third of Europe died of the plague. That would mean anywhere between 75 to 200 million Europeans died from the bubonic plague, which lasted 6 long years, between 1346 and 1353. And yes, the plague was indeed blamed on the Jews. It was said that the Jews did not die from the plague, but Jews poisoned the Christian wells of Europe and caused them to die. It is true that fewer Jews died than Christians. That is true. But fewer Jews died because they washed their hands before eating and when waking up in the morning, every morning. Jews were simply more hygienic, and that saved Jewish lives. In the end, the plague was caused by a parasite that was living on rats that carried the plague from port to port, from port city to port city, by way of ships, of course. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.